When a 13-year-old girl runs away from a Baltimore area group home, she remains missing for months before her remains are found in a wooded area. Investigators strive to identify the predator who took a vulnerable child's life in this episode of Last Seen Alive. Thanks for listening to Last Seen Alive. I'm your host, Leah, crime analyst by day and true crime storyteller by night.
As always, I'm your co-host, Scott.
This case was suggested to us by a listener, Gretchen. Thanks for the case suggestion, Gretchen. This is one of those extremely tragic yet little-known cases that could really use a public awareness boost. I'm originally from the small state where this occurred, so I have a special interest in crimes from this area. And still, I'd never heard of this case until I received your message. This is exactly the kind of case suggestion that we deeply appreciate. Now, a quick heads up. This case is about the death of a child victim. This episode also contains discussion on the subject of sexual assault. We won't go into any graphic detail, but still, please listen with care. Sarah Forrester was last seen alive on April 28, 1999. She was 13 years old at the time and lived in Catonsville, Maryland, which is a suburb of Baltimore. At the time, she was a resident of a group home for at-risk children. One of her parents, her dad, Larry, was deceased, having died a couple of years beforehand. Her mom, Rose, was still living at the time, but didn't have custody of her. She also had several siblings who she did not reside with. Little is publicly known about Sarah's childhood, other than that it was not easy. When it comes to the group home she was living in, the news sources available on this case don't mention it by name, but they do give its location. It was located on Bloomsbury Avenue. Therefore, we know that the facility where Sarah was residing was likely a long-time institution at the given location called simply the Children's Home. It's been in operation for a very long time, since around the time of the American Civil War, actually, although it has, of course, changed and modernized over the years. The location where the home stands now is the same location the institution has been in for the past century. The campus is large, sprawling over 44 acres or about 28 hectares. It's a place where social services and the juvenile court system can place kids who don't have parents or guardians able to care for them. The Children's Home describes itself on its website as a place that provides, quote, residential and community services to promote long-term well-being and success for young people and families who experience disruption in their lives, end quote. I took a look at the home's reports and learned that they provide services to more than 100 children each year. I imagine that the numbers were likely similar in 1999 since it's such a long-standing facility.
Yeah, for a facility to have that much history, first off, it's incredible that it survived so long and survived the Civil War.
Right, when it started out, it was actually a home specifically for German orphans of the Civil War. It was very niche. Today, it's much more broad. Although we don't know the details of Sarah's time there, we do know that at just 13 years old, she was younger than the average child who received services at the Children's Home. And we know that regardless of how difficult her family life circumstances may have been, it of course must have been difficult for her to live in a home away from all of her family and everyone she'd ever known.
Yeah, that's really difficult. I mean, if she didn't really have much memory of anything other than that, that'd be one thing. But to have this family that you know about and these relationships, and then to be essentially stripped away from that, that's incredibly sad.
Yeah, she'd been through a lot at this point in her life. And it was so difficult, in fact, that she ran away from the home. That happened on February 20th, 1999. Now, what exactly caused her to run away, whether she had plans to meet with anyone or to go anywhere specifically, we don't know. Her story was not considered newsworthy until 3 months later when her remains were discovered. And this did not occur in Catonsville. Rather, it occurred a few miles north of the Children's Home in the Woodlawn area of Baltimore County. The discovery of Sarah's remains was made by children. It was just before the school day on May 13, 1999, and 2 kids were playing in a wooded area behind the Belmont Park apartments in Woodlawn. They stumbled upon badly decomposed human remains and ran out of the woods, screaming about what they'd found. Now, nearby adults assumed at first that the kids were mistaken. Maybe they'd found the remains of an animal or something, but A human? Probably not. Little kids tend to have big imaginations, after all. Still, just in case, one of the adults, a mom named Lori who lived in the apartment complex, went into the woods to check out the spot the kids had described for herself. It was a slope leading down to a stream. There, to her shock, she found what were clearly human remains. Of course, she called police. Later, she'd tell WMAR2 News, quote, "I walked down the ditch and, I seen what I wanted to think was a dead animal or something. I didn't want to believe it was a body," end quote. However, it did appear to be human. Plus, Lori could plainly see that either a blanket or a sheet had been draped over the remains, and it appeared to be bloody. This suggested, of course, something other than the natural, unnoted passing of an animal. When officers from the Baltimore County Police Department arrived on scene, they found exactly what Lori had described: a human body draped with a blanket or sheet of some kind. Beneath the blanket, the body was unclothed. Decomposition was well underway, and they estimated that the body had been there for weeks. Upon their initial survey of the scene, they couldn't tell the deceased person's sex, race, or much else. It would take a medical examination for those details to be revealed. And the remains had indeed been there for some time, as was evidenced by the advanced state of decomposition. In fact, investigators would learn that the week before, some other kids from the neighborhood had been playing in the wooded area where the body had been found and had reported finding a body to their parents. However, their parents had assumed that the kids had actually found animal bones and were mistaken. So it wasn't until Lori checked out the scene the following week that anyone realized that the kids had been right all along. Had she not checked out the woods just in case, there is no telling how long it might have taken for the remains to be discovered by an adult.
Yeah, I mean, we're really fortunate that Lori did check it out because, I mean, it's easy to imagine kids in the wood coming up with a fantastical story about an animal or whatever because that's what's out there. But it does take an adult checking to verify and make sure that nothing nefarious has happened in your own backyard, essentially.
Sure, in most cases, when children go into a wooded area to play and they come back telling you they found bones, well, it's usually going to be an animal that passed away of natural causes. So, understandable. Now, Lori, who lived in the adjacent apartments with her 2 children, was, understandably, shaken up by the discovery. Afterward, as police worked behind the taped-off crime scene, she told WMAR2 News, quote, "I'm sick. I'm really sick to know that something like this could happen right where I live," end quote. Shortly thereafter, the medical examiner who conducted the autopsy first determined that the remains belonged to a young female and that she had been severely beaten and repeatedly stabbed. Whether it had been the beating or the stabbing that had killed her wasn't determinable, so her manner and cause of death were ruled to be homicide by traumatic injury. It would take weeks for the remains to be identified as Sarah's. And when investigators learned the identity of the victim, they got to work on attempting to piece together who might have harmed her. They quickly learned that the last known sighting of Sarah, which had occurred on April 28th, so about 2 weeks before the discovery of her remains, had taken place in the Edgewater Village area of neighboring Hartford County. According to an interview a detective gave to WNUV News not long after the discovery of Sarah's remains, that was where she had been staying, reportedly with friends, after running away. The identities of those friends have never been publicly shared, so I can't tell you who they were or how she knew them. I can tell you, however, that Edgewater Village is a pretty good distance from both the group home that Sarah had run away from and from where her remains were found. It's on the opposite side of Baltimore from the children's home, and it's about a 35-mile or 56-kilometer drive from one area to the other.
Yeah, I'm kind of wondering if that was somebody that she knew from before her time at the group home or somebody that she had associations with at some time. That's the only way I can really see this working out.
Yeah, I wondered the same thing. Now, unfortunately, I don't have access to those details. But Sarah's remains were found just a few miles from the place she had run away from, the children's home. However, apparently, during the significant time period during which she'd been missing, she'd been staying in another town about 35 miles or 56 kilometers away. And the reasoning for this, at least to us, is not clear. Did her killer have a connection to the Belmont Park apartments in Woodlawn, which her remains were found behind? Or had she been killed dozens of miles away in Edgewood Village and had her killer abandoned her body elsewhere in an attempt to distance themselves from the crime? Unfortunately, those questions have not been answered. There was a time, however, when it perhaps seemed as if they had been. I say that because in January of 2000, about 8 months after the discovery of Sarah's remains, someone was charged with her murder. Prior to securing the charge, in July of 1999, so a couple months after Sarah's remains were discovered, investigators had obtained a warrant to search a home on Edgewater Drive in Edgewood. This is right in the area where Sarah had been staying with friends after running away. Whether or not the home that was searched was the home she'd been staying in or another nearby residence hasn't been publicly revealed. However, a spokesperson for the Baltimore County Police told journalist Megan Heimbach that they had executed several search warrants in that area specifically because it was where Sarah had last been seen alive.
Yeah, with how fast that seems for making an arrest and the fact that they were doing multiple search warrants, it still kind of feels like it probably was somebody she had known and might have been staying with, because that's the only way I can really see them getting a connection fast enough to make an arrest within 8 months.
I had similar thoughts. In any case, after that, investigators worked the case for several more months, and then they made an arrest. 24-year-old Curtis McKissitt was taken into custody on first-degree murder charges in January of 2000, so approximately 9 months after Sarah had last been seen alive. He lived in Edgewood, and police alleged that he had been responsible for beating and stabbing 13-year-old Sarah to death. According to an interview a police spokeswoman gave the Carroll County Times after McKissitt's arrest, he had known Sarah, quote, for a short time before her murder, end quote. The spokeswoman stated that they had engaged in, quote, unquote, illegal activities, but gave no details. I strongly suspect, however, that this likely means that they believe that McKissitt may have engaged with her or exploited her sexually. Because when it comes to crimes that adult men commit involving teenaged girls, they're usually sexual in nature. And the unfortunate truth is that a runaway, homeless, 13-year-old child with no adult looking out for her safety is at an extreme risk for sexual exploitation.
Yeah, my first thoughts were exactly that, either sexual exploitation or drug use and sexual exploitation.
Right, often the two go hand in hand. Now, to be clear, though, I don't know for sure that that was the case. And for that matter, investigators never charged McKissitt with any of these alleged illegal activities. They only charged him with a single count of first-degree murder. So we can't truly know whether the illegal activities in question really occurred, let alone what they were. I want to emphasize this because Sarah's case is, of course, unsolved, otherwise we wouldn't be covering it, which means that we don't know whether McKissitt was actually responsible for or involved in her death.
Yeah, that stands out as strange to me, because normally whenever you have a case like this where you have multiple potential charges, generally they will throw a myriad of charges at somebody, so that way they can plead down to the lesser charges.
Just one single charge of first-degree murder did stand out to me as odd as well. I mean, when someone commits first-degree murder, there's virtually always other accompanying charges that can be added.
Yeah, and going for first-degree murder, that's not an easy case at all, because you have to prove a whole lot of things like the intent and the methodology and all of these other smaller aspects of the crime. It's much easier to go for something like a simple manslaughter charge.
Right. Now, on the note of sex crimes, however, as I mentioned earlier, when Sarah's body was discovered, it was completely unclothed. This suggests that whoever was responsible, there may have been a sexual element or motivation involved in her murder. In any case, as for how investigators managed to link McKissitt to Sarah's murder, well, according to reporting for the Aegis, she was linked via unspecified evidence found at the scene of where Sarah's body was located and via interviews. And that's as detailed as the reporting gets. I don't know what the evidence they found at the scene was, whether it was forensic evidence such as prints or DNA or something else, like maybe, for example, the blanket her body had been draped with being linked to him or his home, or maybe some other object that we, the public, don't even know was present. Investigators simply have not shared that information with the public, so anyone's guess is as good as mine.
Just to get this out of the way, I'm assuming that the case fell apart and never went to trial. Otherwise, a lot of this information would be open record from the court records.
Yeah, that's exactly what happened, and we'll get into that here shortly. Now, unfortunately, Sarah's murder never made the news outside of Maryland and has received pretty limited coverage. So this isn't one of those cases where we have a wealth of information to contemplate, or where we can point to theories that authorities have publicly acknowledged, or even theories that have become popular among the public. There simply are none. Not many people are talking or have ever been talking about Sarah's case. However, based off of the information available to us, I can think of one theory. More on that next. And now, back to Sarah's story. When 13-year-old Sarah Forrester ran away from a group home, her disappearance received little attention until several months later when her remains were discovered. After months of investigation, investigators charged a 24-year-old man named Curtis McKissitt with first-degree murder in relation to her death. And as soon as I learned that a 13-year-old runaway child was believed to have been murdered by an adult man who had known her for just a short period of time before her death, I wondered whether he was perhaps known or believed by investigators to have been sexually trafficking her. To put it bluntly, I wondered whether the accused could possibly have been a sex trafficker or, in layman's terms, a pimp.
Yeah, it's not hard to make that jump.
Right, because Sarah was, unfortunately, exactly the kind of vulnerable victim who traffickers are known to gravitate toward and exploit. As we've discussed in some past episodes, sex traffickers don't leap out from behind shrubbery and abduct their victims from sidewalks or department store parking lots. They don't need to. They look for vulnerable victims who they can manipulate and exploit without any need to abduct or physically restrain. A 13-year-old runaway girl like Sarah would be exactly the kind of target traffickers would seek to manipulate. After running away from the group home, she would have had no real way to provide for herself, and thus would have been at the mercy of other, older people to have her most basic needs, like food and shelter, met. This is an extremely high-risk situation to be in. According to the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children, traffickers target kids who run away. Literally, that is the title of a page on their website devoted to the subject. As the page goes on to explain regarding runaway children, quote, they often flee from an unsafe environment or pursue what they perceive as an opportunity for physical and emotional safety. Traffickers exploit the lack of support in these youths' lives by seemingly offering connection. Many young people who run away believe that they have found love and support only to discover it is a dangerous illusion. End quote.
Yeah, I think it's important for us to not overlook the fact that these exploitative sex traffickers, they are extremely talented at finding their victims.
Yes, they are.
They are not amateurs. They know the signs. They know what to look for, and they can essentially see it written on the victims' faces.
Yeah, they're predators, and like any predator, they are an expert at picking out the most vulnerable prey. And there is no doubt that at the time of her death, Sarah was desperately in need of love and support. A children's home, however well run, is an institution and is not the same as living with a family. Children, of course, crave the support of a loving family. When that's not available to them, they may seek out and perceive substitutes such as friends, boyfriends, or girlfriends as a desirable alternative.
Yeah, and a lot of the times they see these older individuals that are showing them this unnatural level of affection as a truly emotional connection with these people. They're kids. They are blind to the ways of the world sometimes, and they're not prepared mentally or emotionally to combat this, especially when they're in these extremely vulnerable situations.
Exactly. From an adult perspective like mine or yours, it's easy to see how trying to cobble together a makeshift family while dodging CPS and the cops could lead to danger. I mean, really, how could it not? But to a kid in what feels like a desperate situation, it is much less obvious.
Something as simple as a free meal or shelter could be all that's really needed to start ingratiating yourself into this predatory system.
Right. I know from my training through work that literally a free meal is a real in with kids that traffickers can use to begin to exploit them. Some kid says, They wish they had a burger. Well, here comes some predator to swoop in and say, hey, meet me at, this place. I'll get you a burger. It literally is sometimes that simple.
As ridiculous as it sounds to us as adults, I'm sure a kid, somebody going, hey, here's a Happy Meal and taking them out of their situation for a few minutes, that's a big deal.
Oh, yeah, it can be a big deal. And in fact, this might sound silly, but statistically speaking, it's true. One of the most common gifts that traffickers use to ingratiate themselves to child victims in the current times is vapes. They will offer to buy kids a vape. Very common. Now, according to a study published in the peer-reviewed journal Children and Youth Services Review, foster care runaway episodes are very common. 19% of children placed in foster care at age 10 or older run away on at least one occasion. And of those kids who do run away, 7% of them report being trafficked during that runaway period.
So we're already looking at 1 in 5, and the foster care system in America is massive.
Yeah, about 1 in 5 are running away.
That's thousands of kids, and 7% of them are being trafficked. That's not a small number.
Yes. Now, for the record, that figure includes both kinds of human trafficking, sex trafficking, and labor trafficking. But, no matter how you look at it, it is an enormous figure. Additionally, that study included both male and female children placed in foster care. However, the researchers noted that female children were statistically more likely to be trafficked, so when it comes to how many runaway girls are trafficked, the number is going to be even higher than 7%. And the researchers found that children who ran away at a younger than average age were more likely to be trafficked as well. And that does describe Sarah, who again was only 13 when she ran away. The study found that most foster children who run away didn't do so for the first time until they were 15 or 16 years old. So, could Sarah have been a victim of this type of exploitation? As we discussed earlier, the fact that her body was found unclothed strongly suggests that some element of sexual assault or exploitation may have been involved in her death. And trafficking is, statistically speaking, an alarmingly possible explanation. Now, when it comes to McKissitt, the man once charged with Sarah's murder, I searched Maryland criminal court records to see what kind of history he was known to have, other than, of course, being charged with first-degree murder in relation to her death. And I found that he began appearing in Maryland criminal court records just after he reached adulthood. Of course, it may have started before then in his juvenile years, but those court records are not publicly accessible in the same way that the adult criminal court records are. Now, in any case, I found that McKissitt's history of criminal charges in the state of Maryland included the following: multiple charges related to acts of assault and battery, violation of a protective order, burglary, trespassing, probation violation, possession of controlled substances, malicious destruction of property, and theft. So, McKissitt had a varied criminal history, and some of his crimes had been violent in nature. But that's all we really know for sure, because the month after he was charged with first-degree murder in relation to Sarah's murder, that charge was dismissed. Whether the murder charge was dismissed because investigators had the wrong person and realized it, or whether they still believed he was responsible for Sarah's murder but simply didn't have the evidence needed to prove it beyond a reasonable doubt, is unknown. Investigators have never spoken on the matter. There were a couple of brief news articles published in local papers when prosecutors brought charges against McKissitt, and then a couple more when they dropped the charges. But none of the articles said why the charges had been dropped. A journalist writing for the Aegis noted that they had reached out to Baltimore County prosecutors for comment, but had received no reply. So whether or not investigators still consider McKissitt to be a suspect in this case is totally unknown to the public. What is known, however, is that regardless of how investigators view him, he'll never be charged with any crime related to her murder. And that's because a few years ago, he became a victim of the very crime he was once accused of: first-degree murder.
Interesting.
It happened in August of 2019 in a Baltimore County residence. According to reporting on the murder, the offender, a 22-year-old man named Dante Banks, went to the residence to meet up with an unnamed woman for an unspecified purpose at shortly before midnight. Once there, he reportedly robbed the woman and sexually assaulted her. This prompted an argument between Banks and 44-year-old McKissitt, who was also present in the residence. During the course of the argument, Banks pulled out a handgun, shot McKissitt in the chest, and fled the scene. Paramedics attempted to save McKissit's life, but it couldn't be done. He died shortly after being shot. Investigators quickly identified Banks as the suspect, found him, took him into custody, and charged him with first-degree murder, plus first-degree rape and armed robbery. So, was McKissit truly Sarah's killer, or was the greatest commonality between them the fact that they ended up sharing the same tragic manner of death, homicide? Because it's been years since investigators have publicly spoken of any theory, we don't know what they currently believe. As it stands, McKissit was never convicted of any crime against Sarah. For that matter, he never even went to trial, so we can't assume that the fact that he was once charged means that he was actually responsible for Sarah's death. If not McKissit, though, who might have taken Sarah's life? As we discussed, runaway children are especially vulnerable to being sexually trafficked. Sarah was missing for months, and wherever she was during that time, she was not with responsible adults. If she was being exploited in that way, it's possible that she may have been killed by a trafficker, or perhaps by someone who she was forced to have an encounter with in that capacity. Now, of course, there are lots of other possibilities. The world is full of all kinds of predators, not just sex traffickers. Perhaps Sarah had a boyfriend during the time she was missing, and he took her life. Statistically speaking, most women and teen girls who are murdered are killed by men who they know, often romantic partners. As for the possibility of a stranger killing, I think it's particularly unlikely in this case, and I think that for two reasons. One, as a missing 13-year-old flying under law enforcement's radar, Sarah was obviously in the company of other people in the months leading up to her death. And the kind of people willing to help a vulnerable 13-year-old child hide from the authorities probably aren't terribly adverse to breaking the law generally. That is to say, if Sarah wanted to avoid CPS and the police, she needed to stick with people who were willing to ignore the law. She had to take some risks in order to avoid being located and returned to the group home. 2, there's the over-the-top, hands-on way in which she was killed. She was beaten and repeatedly stabbed to the extent that the medical examiner wasn't actually able to determine which type of assault had actually killed her. This method of killing suggests that her killer was likely in an emotional state of rage when they attacked. Therefore, it seems most likely that Sarah, like the vast majority of murder victims, was killed by someone she knew.
So many times you hear me say this, the level of anger that was exhibited towards her is not something that you typically see with a stranger killing. It's the overkill that is associated with a very personal attack.
Right, yes, often that's the case. During the course of my research for this episode, I looked through news archives for any reports of similar crimes occurring in the area around the time of Sarah's death. I was looking for cases that occurred in Baltimore or its surrounding suburbs within a few years of hers, and that involved girls or younger women who were beaten and or stabbed to death, and whose bodies were found outdoors in a wooded or otherwise naturally concealing area. I figured that if someone was capable of flying off the handle and beating and stabbing a 13-year-old child to death, they might do anything. Like kill again or before in a fit of rage. Maybe Sarah isn't their only victim.
Yeah, it doesn't sound like somebody that's very in control of their emotions.
Even if this person has not killed anyone else, and I think it's very likely that they have, they are definitely someone who has a criminal record. This is going to be a violent person. We're going to see assaults. We're probably going to see domestic batteries. We're going to see violations of protective orders. These are the kind of crimes you can expect to see with someone like this. Now, of all the cases I've read about, only one stood out, and that was the murder of Darlene Giles. She was 31 years old when she went missing from her Baltimore County apartment in December of 1994, so about 4.5 years before Sarah's murder. Darlene's family members reported her missing after not hearing from her for several days, but it took months for her to be found. And when she was found, about 2.5 months later, it was in a wooded area of Baltimore County, about a half-mile drive from her home. 2 residents of the area were out for a walk in that wooded area when they stumbled upon human remains that had obviously been there for quite some time. They first noticed a leg, which was sticking out of some brush. The remains were Darlene's. The medical examiner who performed her autopsy determined her cause of death to be trauma to the head and neck, specifically multiple cuts, and her manner of death to be homicide. So there are obvious similarities between Darlene and Sarah's cases. Both victims were killed via upper body trauma, both were stabbed or cut, and both of their bodies were found in wooded areas in Baltimore's western suburbs. Both victims were female, and although one was a child and one was an adult, it's perhaps worth pointing out that at just 4 feet 10 inches tall and 105 pounds, Darlene was almost the exact same height and weight as Sarah, who stood 4 feet 11 inches tall and had weighed 102 pounds. Physically, they were remarkably similar in stature. So, are these similarities just coincidence? Honestly, probably yeah. Even so, if I were investigating either of these cases, I would certainly be interested in comparing the details. Speaking of which, according to the Baltimore County Police Department, Darlene's body was fully clothed when found. So in addition to the similarities, there are definitely differences between the two cases as well. Overall, exceedingly little has been publicly shared about Darlene's death, which has been the subject of exceedingly little reporting. Compared to Darlene's case, there is a wealth of information publicly available about Sarah's, which is saying something. At the very least, Sarah and Darlene's cases are united by the fact that they both deserve more public attention. In recent years, Baltimore County Police have appealed to the public, urging them to share any information they may have, no matter how small it may seem, about Sarah's case and about Darlene's. They say that no crime is ever forgotten, and they need your tips. Although these cases may not have received the attention they deserved, it's not too late to solve them. At the time of this recording, $2,000 rewards are being offered in both cases. If you supply information that leads to the solving of either case, you could be eligible. Today, Sarah's remains are at rest in a burial plot beside her father's in West Virginia. She has surviving siblings and other family members. Darlene was a mom of 2 and likely also has surviving family. If you know anything about the death of Sarah Forrester or the death of Darlene Giles, please call the Baltimore County Police Department at 410-887-3943. You can also text the Baltimore County Police Department's Homicide and Missing Persons Unit at 443-862-9426 or email them at homicide@baltimorecountymd.gov. And if you wish to remain anonymous, you can report your tip to Metro County Crime Stoppers. Check out their website, metrocrimestoppers.com, for information on how to submit a tip. And if you found this case to be of special interest, you may want to check out our episode on the unsolved disappearance of James Yablonsky. His case isn't related to Sarah's, but like Sarah, he was 13 years old when he ran away from home. Despite extensive search efforts, he's never been found. We aired our episode on his case in March of 2025. You can scroll back to then in our feed to listen if you'd like.
That's all for this episode of Last Seen Alive. Thanks for listening. Make sure you check out our website, lastseenalivepodcast.com, for photos from the story and links to the sources we used to write it. While you're at, follow us on Insta at LSA Podcast and TikTok and YouTube at Last Seen Alive Podcast. Episodes of Last Seen Alive air every Monday. See you then. And if you think bringing unsolved cases like Sarah's and Darlene's to the public's attention is important, please take a moment to rate or review Last Seen Alive and tell your friends to check us out too. We really do appreciate it. Also, don't forget to check out our merch store, which is up and running again with new designs after a hiatus. It's where you can get all kinds of LSA goodies like t-shirts, hoodies, and coffee mugs. We donate 50% of the proceeds from every sale to the DNA Doe Project. Last Seen Alive is a Studio 222 production. Research and writing for this episode is provided by you, Leah. Audio engineering, editing, and hot takes are provided by me, Scott.